My name is Mille Bøjer. I'm a co-founder and director of Reos Partners, which is a social impact company that works globally on multi-stakeholder collaboration, particularly in situations of uncertainty, complexity, and often conflict.
And I am Michelle Parlevliet. I've been a peacebuilding practitioner for over 25 years. Here I wear two hats. I work with Conciliation Resources, in an international peacebuilding INGO, supporting their peacebuilding work with facilitation, research and accompaniment. And I also collaborate with Reos Partners as a facilitator and scenario writer. I've been increasingly interested in diving deeper into futures thinking in general and into the transformative scenarios process in particular, to explore how these relate to peacebuilding efforts.
The transformative scenarios process is an approach by which diverse groups of actors come together in a joint effort to develop a set of narratives about the future of their country, their region, or a particular issue area that they're concerned about, involved in, and affected by in some way. The approach was born out of the transition from apartheid in the early 1990s, at a time of significant upheaval and uncertainty in the country. So this was at a time when Nelson Mandela had been released from prison, but the democratic elections had not yet taken place. And in that context, a group was convened from across the political spectrum to engage in a scenarios exercise. This exercise was called the Montfleur Scenarios, and it was facilitated by our colleague Adam Kahane, who was an experienced scenario practitioner but had never worked in such a conflictual environment with a multi-stakeholder group who had an intention not just to adapt to what the future might hold, but actually to influence the future of their country. What Adam discovered in that process was that scenario work can be an extremely useful way for people with divergent interests, values, and beliefs to work together around a common task. There are several reasons why this is so useful in a conflict context. So first of all, scenarios are always developed in a set. So there's never a single scenario, but always multiple scenarios. And this combined with the fact that the scenarios are not proposals or recommendations means that people don't have to agree with each other at the level of beliefs, values, or visions or recommendations in order to develop scenarios together. And this is very liberating when people are working across opposing views, and it really lowers the barrier to collaboration. Secondly, to develop a holistic scenario, you really need many different disciplines and perspectives at the table. And so the task itself requires people to listen to each other's experiences and to engage in a creative dialogue. And thirdly, the scenarios process requires people to set aside their wishful thinking and their maximalist demands, their pre-existing positions, and to engage with the space, not with the space of the desirable, but rather with the space of the plausible. So the conversation is about what could happen, not about what should happen, and not about what will happen. And when we're talking about what will or should happen, our natural mode is to go into debate and to start arguing. But when we're talking about what could happen, we need to bring in the imagination as well as the logic and evidence to the table, and it naturally invites in a mode of dialogue and inquiry. It's really important to understand when working with scenarios that they're not predictions. Our success isn't measured by whether in the future we manage to see something coming, but rather by whether the scenarios inform good decisions and strategies today. Sometimes the most impactful scenarios are the ones that we manage to avoid. The scenarios are also not proposals or recommendations or options. They're rather imagined stories, kind of like a future history. So they're fictions, but they need to be plausible fictions so that when people read it, they are stretching their imagination, but they can see this could possibly happen. It's not a pure fantasy.
In November, Conciliation Resources is publishing a new briefing paper titled Looking Forward. It explores how futures thinking can be applied to peace mediation and reconciliation, how it can help to connect the two, and how it can contribute to more sustainable peace processes. We use the term futures thinking as an umbrella term to refer to the broad spectrum of approaches that exist for analyzing the future and relating it to planning, problem solving, and strategizing in the current reality. The Conciliation Resources paper draws on desk research and especially interviews with some 25 practitioners, analysts, and academics in the fields of futures thinking, mediation, reconciliation, and peacebuilding, All of them have direct experience in various contexts around the world, from Hong Kong to Colombia, and from Northern Ireland to South Africa and the Caucasus. We consider various examples and take a closer look at the TSP approach, given its promise in conflict-affected contexts. The paper discusses benefits and challenges of using futures thinking in peacebuilding practice. It also relates the use of futures thinking to conflict dynamics, in other words, when it's useful, and to what is called peace architecture, in other words, how contemplating the future can be linked to formal negotiation processes at track 1 or top leadership level, but also form part of informal track 2 level processes. Of course, we recognize that the use of futures thinking methodologies isn't new in peacebuilding practice. Many practitioners actually already engage in visioning exercises or use scenarios to problem solve difficult situations they foresee. The main finding in the paper is that the peacebuilding field can make much more and especially more intentional and proactive use of futures thinking approaches, because it's got great potential to help negotiation and reconciliation processes forward.
A lot can be said about what we've learned about doing futures work in a conflict-affected context. Many people say to us, how can people who are traumatized and mired in conflict actually think about the future? It's a valid question. It does require very skilled facilitation. It requires a conducive space, a high level of care to work in a group where conflict and trauma is ever present. But I have to say, it's not our experience that people are not able to think about the future in such situations. What we do notice is that in the transformative scenarios process, people have to co-create something without the pressure to agree on the issues that divide them, but with a requirement to listen, include different perspectives, and develop stories about the one domain they all have in common and are all uncertain about, which is the future. It's a pretty complex task, and so they have to work together over time, often through multiple residential workshops. And over that process, trust is inevitably built without healing being an explicit central aim, and without agreement being an explicit central aim. And this allows people and relationships to change in their own time and on their own terms. In our experience, also, the shift from focusing on one's desired future to thinking about possible futures is useful, because in thinking about possible futures and developing a storyline of how that future could actually unfold, people often come to realize that their visions, their maximalist demands, or their pre-existing negotiating position may be an illusion. And that's been one of the key impacts of the transformative scenarios process in peacebuilding context. The realization among participants that they're unable to tell a convincing story given the realities of the world today where their maximalist demands play out successfully. This is a bit of a wake-up call at times. Another key learning is the value of being willing to break taboos around difficult futures. The scenarios are not only visions, they're not only positive stories, but they're also stories that call attention to future risks and dangers that may be uncomfortable to speak about. So the form of stories, of scenarios, allows for the invisible to be made visible and for the unspoken to be spoken through the power of story.
Futures thinking, including TSP, is no panacea, no miracle solution for addressing or transforming conflict. It's no substitute for other approaches in peacebuilding. And it faces, in fact, many of the same challenges that other peacemaking and peacebuilding efforts do. That said, futures thinking and TSP can provide a very useful space for those involved and affected by conflict to reflect on what could be, to take a broader look at their context beyond the immediate issues and dynamics in the conflict, to draw a wider group of people or society at large into conversation about the future, and to reframe the focus of conversations. Of course, the upcoming CR publication Looking Forward provides much more information on how futures work in TSPs can enhance peacebuilding practice, including how it can be used as a preventive measure, or as a way of reinvigorating a peace and reconciliation process. It can also be used to develop a vision of what the future could look like based on an agreement and compare that to possible futures without it, and to road test or stress test practical ways forward. So there are some useful practices in the peacebuilding field around working with two or more sides, which are less prominent in the multi-stakeholder collaboration space. For example, approaches to communication and negotiation can enhance the application of futures thinking in conflict contexts. Communication in conflict societies tend to be quite positional, often with a primary focus on being right and getting one's point across, rather than on figuring out how to make things work and listening for understanding. People's positions, their communication and behavior in conflict settings, may actually be driven more by emotions rather than rational self-interest, even though the emotional starting points may be rationalized. As if people say, it's obvious that what we want and what we fear is well grounded. So while the emotions may be submerged and get little attention, they do play a role in how people engage with one another. And this suggests the need to support those involved in how they communicate in a futures thinking process and pay close attention to creating good conditions for their engagement. More generally, peacebuilding practice highlights the need for long-term engagement and the importance of using the stories that emerge from a futures thinking process, such as a TSP, for wider public dialogue and engagement, beyond the narrower circle of people that were initially involved. Context specificity is another thing to remember. Peacebuilding reminds us that it doesn't just matter what we do, but also how we do things. Process matters, and recipes generally don't work. And interestingly, with the TSP approach, even though it is more or less a set methodology, it every time gets adapted in the process in response to what comes up in a group and the issues that are highlighted. Now, it's important to remember further that actors who carry or drive a futures thinking process in their society have credibility, which highlights the need to pay close attention to convening and drawing in a wide range of actors. And that in itself, in a conflict setting, might raise questions about engaging with non-state armed groups and how to liaise with external actors that may influence conflict dynamics, even if they're not directly involved. Again, TSP actually pays a lot of attention to convening. It's an important part of the entire process, even though often when people speak about TSP or ask questions about TSP, there may be more questions asked about the stories that are created and how they're created, but the entire process that happens before the creation and after the creation of stories is actually as important, especially for generating a wider conversation in society about what this means for the future and how people can influence their own future. And finally, peacebuilding practice teaches us that parties to conflict tend to be suspicious and fear losing control. This makes them often reluctant to engage with new people, whether they're peacebuilding practitioners or future thinking people. They're also inclined to distrust processes that may take them where they don't want to go. As such, they're resistant to pressure and quick to withdraw into their own camp and to perceive bias on the part of any outsiders. Hence, peacebuilding reminds us of the need to be flexible, to adapt and be creative, and to not rigidly implement an approach, and to reflect on ourselves, on our own beliefs and attitudes, and how this may affect how we engage and how the process unfolds.